Hey, what's up, everybody? It's your mental activist Montoya Smith, aka Black Socrates. I haven't did one of these in forever. We started the politically conscious show, and so I've just been having these thoughts that I wanted to kind of share in reference to this terminology that we keep hearing called merit based. So I'm going to walk you through where that term actually comes from and break down how political narratives are created. And so the crazy part of what made me even decide to do it was I had this funny situation tonight where I stopped by QT and got a drink, and the whole store was literally out of straws. And I'm like, man, I've been living 51 years. I ain't never been to a convenience store that I don't think in my life that was out of straws. But the thing is, QT, I don't know if QT is nationwide, but it definitely is one of the most efficient um, convenience store gas stations in the South. They're all over the place. They pop up all the time and they're just super efficient. All the stores look similar. So just a very efficient gas station. So I can see in a sense why they're taking over since they've come about, if you will. And so I was just like, man, I can't believe I'm in a QT and the entire store is out of straws. How can it be out of straws of anything, right? And so I get to the register and the guy says, I got one straw left. So I got a straw. Pretty cool. So I remember coming outside. So I get outside in the truck and it just popped in my head. I was like, damn, the Doge is being so efficient. QT out of straws. Like that popped in my head. I was like, that would be funny to put on the internet and just take a shot at Elon Musk and Doge and saying, hey, they so efficient. QT ain't even got straws. Now, I'm not saying it's the funniest thing in the world, but it popped in my head and it was just a joke. But had I put that on Facebook, if you will, I'm pretty sure it would have got some laughs, if you will. But the reality is clearly what's going on with Doge has nothing to do with the supply chain for QT, nothing at all, right? But again, I think it was a funny joke. Here's what I'm breaking down. Had I put up that joke and got the laughs, if I continue to kind of push this idea with things that or supply chain is an issue, I could, if I wanted to, I could say everything's related to what Elon Musk is doing, and it has nothing at all to do with the reality for how QT is out of a straw, right? Nothing at all. So now I want to use that silly example to explain how political narratives can be built the exact same way, where you will hear terminology and over by either political party, and it becomes a narrative in the news, and the narrative itself may not have anything to do with actuality. And I would offer, and I'm going to give you some history on the term merit base, that the way you're hearing it specifically in 2025 being used by Trump and other conservatives in this case, that it has nothing at all to do with what actually or factually happens when it comes to hiring in workplaces or students getting into college, which is where we hear that terminology used the most. You want to make sure people are merit based and qualified, right? And so I've talked about this on some of the politically conscious broadcasts. So I'm going to give a slight history, but I really want to break down why the term really exists, if you will. And so the slight history is affirmative action eventually started being pushed. I think maybe I forgot which president kind of put some teeth. And so the concept for during the civil rights period, what our community quite often was pushing for as African Americans with MLK and the civil rights movement, getting these quote unquote civil rights. In a lot of cases, it was rights that were already on the books for us as African Americans. But for example, the South during this Jim Crow period didn't basically enacted actions that, for example, we African American males specifically had been allowed to vote, but they enacted laws on and put laws on the book that didn't specifically always say directed at African Americans, but basically those laws would discourage or make it harder for African Americans to actually vote. So even though it was legally, if you will, on the books all the way up to the Constitution, the South, when it came to Jim Crow laws, quite often were not putting in obstacles to apply those laws, right? And so during the civil rights period, it was basically saying, hey, let's put some teeth behind these laws to ensure that you're not if you will, not including African Americans. And as the civil rights, in a sense, expanded to other groups, as it, in a sense, should have, to say, hey, nobody should be discriminated in this way for these various reasons. And initially, again, based on our ancestors' fight. It started with race, then it extends to gender, then it extends to people with disabilities, and it keeps expanding until recently is expanded to, LGBTQ all the way to transgender. So these are just these different expansions that have happened, with the baseline being, hey, let's make sure that not only do we have this on the law, but we also have, let me see here, let me stop this buzzing, that we also have some teeth to ensure that we can back this. And so the teeth, what happened was a lot of companies, private companies, scale their business by doing business with the government, right? They're able to scale their business in that way. And so the way the government was able to put teeth and say, hey, let's take some affirmative actions to make sure that these companies that do business with the government actually have a diverse workforce. Let's make sure these colleges that we actually provide a lot of money to, in order, for public education, public colleges, if you will, provide a lot of money to. Let's make sure that they also have a diverse student body, if you will. And so it basically was saying, if you're going to do business with us, there's just expectation that you are, adding diversity to your workforce or to your student body. And so prior to, quote unquote, the affirmative action to do that by the government, for private companies that were in contract with the government, or colleges that were receiving tax money for their colleges, then that was what the government required. And so you can imagine when that first goes on the books, workplaces or colleges didn't necessarily follow suit initially. And so what ended up happening was, eventually the government put some teeth by saying, hey, you're not meeting these requirements, we're going to take your money. And so when those type of things started happening, the private sector and public colleges took notice and said, okay, not only is it on the books, but the government is actually going to enforce to continue getting, these funds. We need to act accordingly. So if you were a private company that was for private company not doing business with the government, or somehow a college that somehow didn't take public funds, then it didn't affect you. But that's not the majority, right? And so those were protections and guidelines that ended up being put in place, and that's how you saw private companies actually starting to diversify their workforce. Now, here's the thing. At that time, when they saw that the government was serious, and let me highlight something else that I saw to just give a full context. That's always the goal here, to give context and perspective. So I saw a video earlier, like yesterday or a couple of days ago. It was a reminder, something I'd seen before, but I think it was Toni Morrison. She was on an interview, right, where she got asked about racism and white people, and she kind of just, in the short of that video, just giving a quick paraphrase, with her saying black people or shouldn't be, or have nothing to do with should have nothing to do with fixing racism inside of white people, and said that white people needed to figure it out, why they have this insane view, like this is their own insanity, this creation of racism. And seeing that video is pretty much why I'm here. I've always loved that video, but that reminder made me want to break down something that most people really, in a sense, never thought about. I'm a former legal studies major, so I've just looked into a lot of these laws when I was in college years ago. And so I'm not saying I have all the information exactly correct, but again, just having done a lot of research is just piece of context. I'm gonna make it relate to the Toni Morrison interview. Is this? So again, I said the discussion is about merit base. So what happened was, places that were doing business with the government and said, okay, now we're going to have a risk of losing this contract, and even colleges that says we're going to lose some of this public funds if we're not now diversifying our workforce or our student bodies. We have to do something about this because we don't want to lose this, this money from the government. So what some colleges and some private sector private sector companies did, and then government um, government based organizations, whether it's the police department or the fire department. So the government itself definitely started diversifying because now we're the one enforcing it, so therefore we must diversify. And so private sector and even some government agencies, whether it was within the state, whether it was locally, and then public colleges started to diversify. Well, one of the ways that some of them would do it to ensure they continued to get those government funds that they were dependent on, key word here, government funds that they were dependent on, some of them said, okay, this is how we'll skirt this. This is what, in a sense, white people decided to ensure that they kept getting the government funds that they depended on. Some of them started putting in quotas to ensure that they would be diversified enough to continue getting these public funds. Again, a lot of private sector companies scale to larger businesses by doing contracts with the government. So if you're listening and following what I'm saying, our ancestors who fought to ensure that there were civil rights for us as African Americans never once asked for quotas or a lower qualification to go to a school or to get into a workforce. They just said, can we put something in place to ensure that we're being considered for other sectors? Because prior to civil rights, quite often, the Black community specifically was reduced quite often to the menial jobs that we now say that a lot of immigrants, if you will, that come from come now fill those positions. So we were, in a sense, the farm workers. We were those cleaning buildings and just limited to a lot of industries that before civil rights was put in place. You could be the exception to go into other industries. You might be a one of only one in better paying jobs, if you will. And so before the middle class kind of came into existence, our majority of our community, and most people don't know this, but even in, for example, the 1950s, 70% of African Americans were living in abject poverty in this country. Like, that's a reality that a lot of people don't know. And at the time, it's being reduced to a big portion of that is being reduced to the menial jobs that paid lower, that paid the lowest, if you will. And so, so even when minimum wage gets put in place, if you were in farm work, you didn't have to apply. That didn't apply to you. I think it's Spencer Haywood is the person who opened up the NBA, for example. Just to give this quick aside, he was the first one to be able to go to college go to the NBA without having 4 years of college, and he put in hardship because his mother in 1970 was working for $2 or $3 a day as a farm worker in 1970. And the hourly rate at that time was maybe $3 and something, $2 and something or something per hour. She was making that all day picking cotton because they didn't apply. Those were the jobs we were filling prior to civil rights allowing us in the 70s. If you were able to get out of farm work, that's when we, in a sense, as African Americans, entered the workforce and in other industries. And a big part of that was due to the government putting teeth and setting those guidelines. But as I've explained, a lot of those white-owned companies at the time trying to ensure that they receive government funds so that they could scale. Some of them chose, out of their ignorance, let's just put in quotas to ensure that we get it. And so in 1979, University of California versus Beck, I think I'm saying it right, goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court officially shoots down quotas. So at that point, it becomes illegal to let people come into any position, whether it's a college or a job with lower qualifications, And at the time, obviously, specifically focused on race or even gender at that time. That's already included in the expansion. So you could not get these, you couldn't get diversification legally by lowering standards. Now, again, like all things, just because it gets in a sense put in as the law of the land at the Supreme Court, you still would see different companies, or even up to almost 10 years later, the NY New York firefighters, not quite a decade later, but maybe 8 years later, they were still allowing African Americans to get in with lower qualification, just because they themselves are taxpayer government entity, so they need to meet the qualifications, because the government can't be enforcing it if if the fire department is not trying to represent the demographic that it serves. And you can imagine New York with this melting pot. They shouldn't have an all-white fire department, if you will, right? And so again, the individuals who were over that selection were still now going against the law. And so when those type of things got put in the public, then there was more diligence. And after that point, after that level of diligence happening, and the government entity, a public government entity, is basically breaking its own rule, if you will, then you get more teeth, and that stops happening. So we're talking about 70 to the 80s, if you will, right? 77, late 70, I'm sorry, back is in 79 to the late 80s. Once that happens, the idea of lower for qualifications is completely dead, but the rhetoric remains. So I'm entering college in the mid 90s, and the focus is on affirmative action. And I remember being in college, from the 93 to 97, if you will, and constantly having these conversations. This is when I did a lot of this research, because I was a legal studies major. But I remember having these conversations and back and forth with my student peers, and as African Americans who, in a sense, we were basically put in a position to talk about quotas, which were now illegal, but that was the terminology that came extended because there was at least a decade where that was being abused by different colleges, different government agencies, and even private sectors, because that, again, it was shot down, but it took years to put teeth in it, if you will. And so a lot of people remembered that period, and even though it was, in a sense, no longer happening, it was still how people referred to affirmative action. And so here we are as African American students and other people who defended affirmative action as something that was necessary, because it was obviously based on the history of this country, that, hey, this one group didn't have the same start as everyone else, so we got to make sure there's consideration to ensure that they're able to compete and allow in other industries, and not just the menial jobs. Again, just kind of putting everything in context. And so I remember going through college, doing this research and having these discussions where it was kind of like, we would say stuff like, how is it not okay to, if there's a qualified African American, to make sure that they get in, because again, this is illegal now. It had been legal since 79, took some years to put it in space, put it in force, if you will. And now that rhetoric is living on. But here's the crazy part, and this will make the biggest point of tonight. So forgive me for however long I've been rambling on with this thing, but here's the biggest point. And I had to learn this get the information before I could actually make this statement, because at the time, as a college student, I didn't know this, but I can look back on it now and go, the craziest part is the civil rights that was fought for to make sure that these laws that are already on the books are being honored. At no point, and I've already said this in this same video, at no point did the black people that were fighting for civil rights, that ended up extending to all the other groups, at no point had us as African Americans ever asked for lower for qualifications. So this idea that DEI should be merit-based actually came out of white people's insanity to ensure that they had access to government contracts or a continuation of receiving public funds to these colleges out of their own insanity. They said they would lower the standards because they wanted to keep getting that money. What does that tell you? What does that tell you? What that tells you is that the government dependency for these private companies and these colleges is so high that they could let a few people in under their standard qualifications because that individual employee, those individual employees or those students who quote unquote were getting let in when they did have quotas, they were not enough to harm their bottom line. Because one of my co-hosts on the Politically Conscious said, "Hey, colleges are just a business. They just want people that can pay," and he's absolutely right about that. That part. But what happens was these companies and these colleges were so dependent. And the funny thing is, they put in quotas. We never asked for them. That's the insanity of racism. That it was put in by white people who were basically dependent on government funds to ensure that they keep getting them. So they took the risk of saying, all right, we'll let some lower qualification people in just to ensure that we still get this money. Not something that we ever asked for. So here I am in the early 90s, not knowing what I just told you, up here defending the need for affirmative action because it played a role in diversifying even our lily white college, which I went to, a military college, right? And so crazy how white people came up with something. And now, after getting shot down in court because they were lowering standards, now, in a sense, you see a lot of people who say we want things to be merit based as if we ever asked for it. But in order to keep getting money from the government, they were willing to lower their standards. Now, let's talk about the psychology of that. And so, currently in 2025, when the idea of DEI is being shot down because we want to have a merit based country, there are African Americans who are saying, yeah, we no longer, need the DEI. And their perspective is from the aspect of African Americans, in a sense, quote unquote, being dependent on it. And I've explained that when you understand how DEI initiatives actually work, especially now that quotas are disqualified and have been enforced, if you will, um, by the early 90s. So what's that, 90, at least 20, 30 years, you don't have people getting in, one, for with lower with being unqualified. That doesn't exist legally and enforced. And so the crazy part is African Americans will go back and forth as if somehow the fight for it, which now, when with the way that it is legally enacted, DEI is a guardrail. It's not something that any African American or any other group that qualifies under DEI can depend on. The guardrail is to say, hey, make sure there is diversity in the workforce, make sure there's diversity in the student body. But neither one, the hiring, the employer or the college, they cannot lower their qualifications to ensure that. So what does DEI do now? It makes them spend money to ensure that they have a diversified applicant pool. That's what DEI enforces, and it creates. And somebody like myself, who actually worked in minority enrollment for the Air Force Academy, that specifically there was funds to ensure that we were letting more students, diverse students, know about our school. That's what DEI has been for the last 20 plus years, on the government level, on the private sector level for companies that were doing business with the government. Again, if you're a private sector company that doesn't, DEI doesn't apply to you. You can choose to do it or choose not to do it, or for colleges. That's the reality of what DEI has been. And so this has been a long video to explain the term merit based is just a made up term in current times based on the legal use of DEI. And it's not me just saying it. Here's the reality. So I'm talking about building a political narrative. And so when we say we want a merit based company, that's how, when, for example, I was using this example, when the United Airlines pilot Scott Kirby, and that's Scott, yeah, well, not pilot, I'm sorry, United Airlines CEO Scott Kirby highlighted that he was going to have a DEI initiative to get more people of color and women into the cockpit. Because of the misuse of the term merit based, you had a Candace Owens and an Elon Musk say silly shit like, um, and Candace said she'll be afraid to see a woman, a black pilot, because wouldn't be sure if he's qualified. And Elon says, we're gonna have to have a whole bunch of people die before they get rid of some silly DEI program. This is all rhetoric based on the made up narrative of merit base, because as was clear specifically in the airline industry, is the FDA is not going to change its qualification for how somebody can be approved to be a pilot. Nothing was going to change with that. So when United Airlines CEO Scott Kirby highlights that he's going to use a DEI program, what he's talking about is, once again, setting aside money to advertise and also consider how can they make, for example, getting a pilot's license more affordable for groups who may not have access to enough finances, who could easily qualify. But if the barrier was the financing, that's what he means by I will recruit more, increase the applicant pool. But the reason he was doing it wasn't simply to diversify United Airlines. There's a pilot shortage. So it ends up, there's basically a real bottom line effect by not having enough pilots. And they realize part of that is we have not marketed properly to get more women who can fill those positions, because we don't have enough qualified pilots to fill those positions. And so let's make a concerted financial effort via DEI focus to recruit and increase the applicant pool. That is the reality for how diversity, equity, and inclusion plays out, specifically as it goes to race and gender. Now, I've talked about this on the Politically Conscious show. A lot of what we're seeing currently with the idea of shooting it down is with the extension of DEI, including, if you will, transgenderism and that type of thing. And so there is, whereas back in the 70s and 80s, as I just explained, insane white people lowered their standards just to keep getting government money, because that's what they were dependent on, right? So we don't ever really respect dependency when it's being done by the employer or the white person with a company that wants to stay dependent on government contracts. And so when they, in a sense, stopped them from just being able to lower the quota. So what a lot of private sectors, is another aside just to show you how dependency actually works, but you'll never hear it in this way. Some of the companies said, "Oh, we still want to get those government contracts. We don't necessarily have a good enough applicant pool to verse our company." But what they'll do sometimes to keep getting the contracts is they will have an African American or a woman basically serve as a figurehead to keep getting those contracts by saying, "Hey, see, we are diverse." So it's kind of a way that they get around even the current legalities of DEI. And so what does that show? The abuse. That's an abuse of the system. But that abuse of the system shows me once again how dependent this company is on this money. But we will mischaracterize wanting to be merit based as African Americans, and somehow we're dependent on DEI, and while at the same time highlighting how white women and all these other groups benefit from DEI much more than African Americans, and foolishly are saying that to say, yeah, we should get rid of it and not be dependent on it. When I just broke down, once you understand why quotas even existed in history, why they're no longer in existence, and why the term merit base is falsely being used right now, is all because those who are actually dependent on that government money they were the ones who once lowered the standard. They were the ones that will dupe the system right now just to keep getting that contract by putting in a woman figurehead or an African American figurehead and not necessarily really diversify their company. Like, they're the ones that would jump around. So this is all the madness of white people trying to figure that out. And at no point did our ancestors ever ask for a lower qualification. And all we asked is, when we meet the merit, make sure there is an opportunity, because prior to civil rights, that was often being denied. That's all we ever asked. We never asked to get in without merit base. Not at no point. That's just the craziness that the government and white people themselves, they went through that. And because of dependency, we see all these changes. Now, what we're witnessing right now is, again, nowhere can you legally find where merit base has, where some company has hired somebody without merit, because again, that's illegal for the last 20 years and it's been enforced. So that's why you don't hear no real examples like you did when court cases were happening of somebody getting in without merit. It's like there was real court cases when that was happening. That's how California that even came into play. But now you just hear it in rhetoric because it's not a real thing. It's not a real thing because the rhetoric is brought on because of this one thing, and I'll end this. By 2043, our country is going to be majority minority. Whites will still be the largest group, if you will, from a racial standpoint, but they will no longer be the majority. Currently, right now, our country is about 60% white, if you will. But by 2043, that number will drop under 50%, and our country will become majority minority. And so, on Politically Conscious, myself and Shelley got into an argument about currently what you're seeing with DEI. I said is a fight for resources, and I think he foolishly, for whatever reason, somehow thinks this rhetoric is just being used just to be used. To a degree, that was how I took it at the time. And I'm like, no, this is rhetoric, and we're applying merit-based, creating the propaganda that the goal is to be merit-based, when there's no examples over the last 20 years where qualifications have been lowered anywhere to allow students to get in college or to get a job. Now, I'll say this, having worked in college admissions, what DEI does is increase applicant pools to give the college an opportunity, a better opportunity to diversify, because without the funds to be spent on marketing, and what it actually takes to actually find students, for example, that are from diverse backgrounds. That's not money that, again, because of college is a business, I'll use this as an example and close this out. But because of college is a business, that's not money that they would typically spend when they already have enough applicants applying from the majority, which is the case in a lot of places. It's basically, if you've been in college, you've been around for 50 or 100 years, yeah, you have plenty of applicants, and your applicant base will be short of diversity, because quite often some of the diversity, it's not that you don't want diversity in your schools, but at the end of the day, people do what's simplest and cheapest. And what's simplest is cheapest. If I have enough applicants who qualify and already are applying, then we're just going to pick from the people who come to us, and then, and obviously do some marketing. If you're a big time college and got a big time football program that helps market itself as well. But there's so many colleges it doesn't work that simple for most colleges. And the reality is, if people know about you already, quite often that's not going to be a diverse group, especially if that diverse group doesn't, one, live near you, or historically um, doesn't necessarily, especially if you are a private school that receives public funds as well, so therefore you're dependent on that as well, then having the funds for a lot of demographics is not simply there. So that's where a lot of that money, Pell Grant money, goes through to help those students get into some of those more expensive colleges. And so again, if your applicant pool is enough to get your, let's say you're a college that lets in, 5,000 a year, then it's easier just to recruit for those who come into you. That's cheaper. And so if the government is saying, no, you need to have diversify your student body in order to keep getting this public funds, then that's where the school needs to show, even if they don't necessarily, even if it needs to show not only that they're increasing a diverse, but they can also show their efforts by how we spent the money to actually recruit more. Is to diversify applicant pools. Those colleges cannot lower their standards to let those students in. So what I've been rambling for 35 minutes. So if you captured this, it's crazy to see how propaganda can be born. And that's a specific example of how the term merit base is being misused after 20 years of no examples of any companies or colleges being able to lower qualification. Like I said, the ceiling is got applied to the FDA, who's never going to lower their standards to allow somebody to be a pilot. But again, when you got to, so how propaganda works is you say something, you keep saying it over and over and run it through the news. But the real play is worrying about our country becoming majority minority. And so you start running the propaganda to ensure, and this is what happens every time DEI is ended. I can give you many of examples, but I won't bore you with them now. Anytime DEI ends, the already majority, the overrepresented majority, whether it's in a hiring situation or a college situation, what happens every time DEI ends is they gain more positions. Why? Because there's no guardrail to ensure diversity. And so my co-host, when I try to explain that on the Politically Conscious show, my co-host said, are you saying these colleges are saying they don't want black kids? No, not at all. If you understand what I just broke down, you just do what's cheapest and simplest when you already have an applicant pool who has historically maybe already come to the college or have been coming for years. You just recruit from that applicant pool, and it usually doesn't have enough diversity to meet the government standard to continue getting that public funds. So the government, by putting teeth and requiring that there's a diverse student body or diverse higher employment to continue getting a government contract, makes these companies open up their applicant pools. That's the guardrail. That's the reality. Cannot lower, cannot have a less merit base. I worked specifically in college recruiting, and there was no way I could get and I worked specifically for minority enrollment, but anybody I recruited, they had to meet a certain standard to get directly into our school. We also had a preparatory school for those who were slightly lower than the actual qualifications to get into school, and we could make cases to get them into the prep school. But any student that couldn't qualify for the prep school, I couldn't get them in no matter what I thought of them. No matter how many times I sat down with them and say, hey, get your scores up here, or get this, if you can get this, we can qualify you. But they had to at least meet the minimum qualification to go to the prep school or the actual academy. Never could get a student in who was not qualified. Again, it's not legal, cannot be done. So the term merit base is just being used to take back equity and positions, because again, as I just said, anytime a DEI program is ended, the only thing, you can go check this with any place you've seen it, go look at University of Texas Law School when they ended their DEI years ago, University of Michigan when they ended there at the law school level, at the law school level. And then in 2023, you remember the Asians just brought their case to the Ivy Leagues, and The Supreme Court shot down affirmative action in admissions, and right now it's only a year later, but they're seeing that it didn't help more Asians get in, if you will. It didn't lower how many African Americans got in. Guess who got in more in some of those places? Once again, what always happened. The already overrepresented white majority in a lot of those schools, more of them have gotten in. It's only 1 year removed, so we can keep watching it. But I know it's going to happen because I've seen this play when Prop 209 ended in affirmative action in the California back in 98, 99 or something like that. That's always what happens. So that's definitely a fight for resources, but we're being tricked by the rhetoric of merit based because you got, again, people playing around with the word that is not even legally allowed. But what happens is, even for us as African Americans, you got some saying, yeah, we don't need DI anymore. And the reason they're saying it is because they want to feel like they got into the position because of their merit. And so they think it's a psychological effort thing. And the reality is you've only ever got any position in the last 20 years legally because you're merit based. That's already what's happening. So they're just playing with it to take away and gain slots in a country that is becoming quickly becoming minority, a majority minority country. So that's how political rhetoric is born. Let me see. I got a couple comments. I got one comment. I think let's see. It says, and people are just ignoring the fact that he keeps saying merit based as if it will benefit us. Yeah, it is. It don't matter. Yeah, I agree. I agree. It's not even like it's the you get rid of DEI to ensure that the majority can have slots without any recompense. Now, I will say, and I've been saying this quite often on the Politically Conscious show, and I'll keep saying it because some of it is what's happening right now wasn't even directed at the African American community. It's the extensions, the extension specifically by the Biden administration to really, if you will, enforce that, if you will, transgenders are being considered, and they did it within their own administration. And so there was a lot of money that was set aside to have companies that were doing, if you will, if you're doing business with the government, you would have to meet these requirements. And so there was money being spent, for example, to understand how to accept others who are transgender. And so that is really the driver of ridding ourselves of DEI, and then the assumption that this transgender and these different people, quote unquote, because it's been the rhetoric since the 70s of being not qualified. Again, it's all rhetoric, and I already did a whole video on explaining exactly how that came about. So you just keep that rhetoric going and saying these unqualified people are why you're experiencing this. And it did bring down, if you will, company morale and stuff like that, having to be enforced by the government to implement these additional trainings and additional classes. So to be fair to why the attack on DEI exists, it's really because of that, which didn't. So for African Americans, we end up being collateral damage because they wanted, the FBI was having these, like I got a friend in the FBI that was having all these additional trainings and money was being spent. And they're saying that money is a waste. So that's the money that Biden and them put in place. They want to take that away, which ends up ripping out the DEI that has historically been in place that has nothing to do with merit or not, but you use that term analogy as propaganda to be able to take those programs away, to say, hey, we've been allowing people to get in without merit, so we will now, as Trump said, become a merit-based country again. That terminology is a joke, but that's why the attack happened. We just end up, and I say we being collateral damage, because again, our ancestors put this in place as a guardrail because we were not considered in a lot of industries. Big thanks to our ancestors, we now work in all these industries, and so a lot of the industries that we were relegated to is now what you see with the immigration, with the immigrants, when we think of, those farm workers and things of that nature, which now is filled by a lot of immigrants. if you will. So basically they replaced what we used to do before civil rights allowed us to expand in the industry. And so for any immigrants that are here, for not the majority of them are, but for the ones that are here illegal, they can't expand into the workforce, obviously, because of their back, can't expand into these higher paying jobs because they're not in fact citizens. So they work in the industries in which that's not a requirement, construction and farming. So our country is absolutely dependent on them, just as the country was dependent on us when companies by choice was not allowing us in mass to work in other industries. Now that our civil rights allowed us to expand into that, the reality is, generally speaking, we don't want to do a lot of those quote unquote menial jobs either, because we don't have to anymore. So that's what civil rights did by giving us the guardrail of affirmative action, so that we would be considered, giving us the guardrail of saying, hey, make sure you are marketing and expanding your applicant pool in order to have a diverse workforce. And so it got abused by white people from the 70s all the way to almost the mid 80s by putting in quotas just because they were dependent on government money. You never hear it that way, but that's the reality. And then eventually the legal cases stopped that. And so the terminology propaganda has been brought back to attack it in a way that's not factual. Merit-based is a propaganda word used for a political mean, and that's to ensure that the white majority is able to continue to maintain the workforces that they feel like they're going to need as the country again becomes majority minority. That's my 3 cents. If any of this makes sense, share with your friends. Holla at y'all. All I ask is that you think.